Hello, I'm Keisha Ann Stewart, and the title of my talk today is Narratives Matter, the Politics of Storytelling. I've always enjoyed a good story. My dad was a storyteller in our family. He used to tell us folk tales, fables, silly stories, stories about his childhood, and funny stories about his adult friends. I most certainly believe that the fascinating stories about Jamaica's national heroes contribute to why I proudly identify as Jamaican. And it is my love of a good story that made me choose to become an English teacher. I was fortunate to teach literature internationally for several years. However, it was when I returned to teaching in England when I realised that of all the groups I'd taught, black boys in the London school where I was based were the least receptive and made the least progress. That realisation inspired me to research the experiences of black Caribbean male students studying and responding to literature texts at Key Stage 4. I chose to work with this particular group because there is diversity in the Black population, and as I mentioned before, I identify with Caribbean heritage. It has always puzzled me that despite encountering the same challenges, Black Caribbean females tend to outperform their male counterparts. This research allows insight into that phenomenon. Throughout history, systems that endorse racial narratives, practices, and mechanisms have preserved the polar positions of white dominance and black subjectification, resulting in persistent inequalities. Records indicate that Black Caribbean male students have been among the lowest achievers in the UK since the 1950s. Although much research has been conducted, Black Caribbean male underachievement persists. It is important to note, however, that the deficit master narrative of being educationally subnormal defined Black Caribbean boys between 1940 and 1970. Their linguistic and learning differences cemented their inferiority in mainstream narrative, a mislabeling that resulted in them being sent to schools established for students with extreme behavioral and psychosocial needs. During that period, the educationally subnormal narrative flowed through social and political discourses. Black Caribbean boys were told they were not as clever as white boys or girls, so any aspirations they had to progress to higher education were reportedly squashed due to them being told that they were being unrealistic or over ambitious. My research therefore explores the relationship Black Caribbean male students have with reading because in order for students to access the curriculum, they must be able to read well. Furthermore, the successful acquisition of literacy skills is one of the key educational objectives of compulsory schooling. Here is an image of the Progress Aid attainment data, which charts students' progress in the 2021 to 2022 academic year. If you look closely, you will see that the only groups that achieve less than Black Caribbean boys on that chart are the male Roma and Irish traveller groups. This has been the trend for many years. Now, this is an image I'd like you to keep in mind for the duration of the talk. The perpetuation of racism through the representation of Black maleness encouraged me to create an alternative form of Deleuze and Guattari's rhizome and Strimick Powell's white supremacy flower. To truly understand the nature of racism would have to go right back to the root. The notion of Anglo-Saxon exceptionality is considered the source of white supremacy. The seed was planted thousands of years ago and the tree grew. The part of the tree that we can see grows towards sunlight whilst the root system grows away from the sunlight. It doesn't matter how often a tree is felled. If the root system is not demolished, the tree will continue to shoot offsprings, grow and flourish. Additionally, the root system can be invasive, and I think this represents the covert, insidious nature of the system of white supremacy. The uncontrollable root system grows in directions we don't expect and can cause damage and destruction. Furthermore, suckers, which are new plants, grow from the root system. One tree can have many suckers, as indicated by the image here. The more secure these new plants are, the harder to get rid. This slide reveals the numerous fruits the tree of white supremacy bears. I'm sure there are many more, but this document can only hold so many. This image, I feel, represents the firmly rooted, tough, durable, robust, insidious, invasive, and intrusive system that continues to exist today. We must remember that narratives play a significant role in human social and cultural life. My personal understanding of the power and significance of narratives is what encouraged me to explore participants' relationship with reading through the literature curriculum. I reasoned that taking this approach might provide insight into the participants' engagement with literacy practices. So my research looks at whether the text studied on the GCSE curriculum provides students with occasions to respond to stories, situations, or themes that might accompany them along life's path. Do the stories encourage appreciation of various cultures? Do they aid development of emotional intelligence? Do they encourage creativity, nurture the growth and development of personality and social skills? Do they allow movement between local and global cultures? Do they provide insight into the ways in which people live and think in different traditions? We must remember that although the value of studying literature is conveyed through learning opportunities, it is best construed through learners' understanding of the world. When I first started my research, I noted the representation of Blackness in the GCSE curriculum. After more nuanced readings, I realized that it's not just Blackness that is represented in the texts, but Black males. Just take a second to think of the politicization of Black men through various forms of media. How are they depicted on these platforms? What are the stories told? When were these stories established? What is the lifespan of these narratives? How do these narratives affect the way we see them? Critical race theory informs my research. What I like about this framework is that it allows me to explore the concept of race from historical and contemporary experiences. This enables me to identify patterns, developments, or divergences between narratives of the past and narratives of today. CRT allows me to explore how narratives fuse, the fusion of then and now, the here and there, the one and the many. I will briefly address the presentation of Black maleness in 3 literature texts on the GCSE curriculum. These texts are The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Sign of 4, and Pidgin English. So The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was written in the 19th century, sometime between 1885 and 1886. During that time, people were engaged in discussions about Darwinism and Lombroso's theory on criminality. Darwin's theory of evolution helped to support scientific racism, and Lombroso's theory stated that criminality was inherited and criminals could be identified by physical features. In some ways, Lombroso's theory can be linked to Linnaeus's classification of humankind in the 18th century. Here, we can see the merging of narratives, narrative building upon narrative over the course of a century. When reading this text, it is important to remember that slavery was abolished in the USA in 1865, and a civil rights movement from 1865 to 1896 saw the improvement of educational and employment opportunities for African Americans. Some African American men also obtained the right to vote. Within this context, Stevenson writes the novella. These conversations were happening in the background, and these events were taking place in the background. So in the story, the protagonist's suppressed evil side is freed, and this aspect of his character is portrayed as the base nature of humankind. Here on the slide, we can see the presentation of Hyde, who is a foil to the supposedly civilized, educated Dr. Jekyll. According to Willie Lee Rose, in the 19th century, slaves were no longer viewed as luckless, unfortunate barbarians. Instead, they were domesticated, treated and seen as children who were never expected to grow up. During this period, slavery was considered a phase of education, a necessary right, a passage that allowed access to higher morality and culture, and those are the ideas of Tommy Curry. To some extent, these ideas link Hyde to being described as a child of hell within that context. Furthermore, the presentation of Hyde, especially with his dusky skin, reveals the racialized image of the Black man, the criminalization of the Black man. What strikes me most about this story is that it mirrors European anxiety at the time through the decline and death of Dr. Jekyll, whose hands are described as large, firm, white, and comely, in contrast to Hyde's corded, knuckly, and dark hands. From this example, we can see markers of beauty and the distasteful attached to what is considered normal and what is not. When the reader is first introduced to Hyde, he is small in stature. However, throughout the text, he continues to grow and strengthen. The stronger Hyde becomes, the weaker Jekyll gets. The text states that Hyde seemed to have grown with the sickliness of Jekyll, suggesting that established European ideals and those of the lesser other cannot coexist in the same space. The representation of this predatory relationship puts forward the idea that equality is unattainable as social constructs require one dominating force over another that is less so. From the new historicism literary perspective, the strengthening of Hyde and the weakening of Jekyll represents the evolution of established policies and systems that governed the colonized world. Enslaved people of African descent were now free. They were finally entitled to the liberty that has been a natural right of Europeans and their descendants. Based on what was happening at the time, the start of the process of decolonization and Black people gaining human rights, it appears that Europeans were fearful that empowering people of African descent would result in the detriment of white systems and white identity. Similarly, The Sign of Four by Arthur Conan Doyle was written in 1890, and the text's only non-white character, Tonga, comes from a colonized region. On the slide, you can see how Tonga is portrayed in the story. Now, both texts address the fear of the other, with Blackness or otherness depicted as evil, criminal, and subhuman. The idea that Hyde is made to scream like a rat and Tonga is given no language can be linked to Kelly Brown Douglas's suggestion that language is property as well as an indication of one's stock. It can also be linked to Ian Cushing's work on anti-Black linguistic racism. Cushing suggests that Black working-class children are much more likely to have the way they speak categorized as deficient, an idea that holds place in the construct of otherness, which is evident in all three texts. I must mention that Tonga being put on display as a fairground attraction is reminiscent of individuals like Saatchi Baartman and Ottobengha, who were publicly displayed for looking different. The public display of individuals like Saatchi Baartman and Ottobengha fed into the myth of human racial difference and the binary system of what constitutes the norm and the other, eventually entrenching, shaping, crystallizing, and perpetuating this myth into science. Natural scientists have discredited the biological conception of race. However, Latson Billings argues that the construct of race is maintained in economic, social, and cultural spheres. The last text I'll talk about is Pidgin English, which is written by Stephen Kelman. The novel was published in 2011, and it tells the story of a Ghanaian immigrant family who live on a council estate in London. The novel reinforces negative, pervasive stereotypes, such as a stabbing outside of a chicken shop and a black boy's exposure to gang culture. The racial implication of Pidgin English is huge. With so many black literary authors in the UK, to have a white man's story about a black boy and his family selected for the curriculum echoes Spivak's assertion that the subaltern cannot speak. Furthermore, coming from a linguistics background, the title Pidgin English appears to be a mockery of the pidgin, a simplified language that develops within the immigrant community on the council estate. It can be interpreted that the pidgin that develops within this immigrant community is compared with feral pigeons that are thought to carry diseases, damage buildings, and whose droppings incur high cleanup costs. So, through literature, students who are in the process of shaping their identities and forming relationships with each other are fed the violent, unsavory, tragic image of Black maleness. The stories taught in school reinforce the notion that the Black way of life is riddled with hardship, criminality, and tragedy. I think it is fair to say that this is one of the ways that the construct of otherness and its opposition to the European ideal is affixed to education. So through the reinforcement of the constructed other that we see in the stories taught in schools, students are able to witness the interplay of white dominance and non-white subordination. Additionally, the texts illustrate the dependence of the ideology of white superiority and how it is grounded in the narrative of anti-Blackness. Including such texts on the curriculum helps to maintain the normalized racial structures and systems that have been operationalized in society. This curriculum, therefore, illuminates the racial hierarchies of privilege and oppression and supplies oxygen to the myth of racial separateness. It is very important for us to remember that stories are subtly reshaped, reconstrued, and given new meaning each time they're told. Will we continue to allow the shadow of the narratives about Black Caribbean males that are rooted in history to haunt us? Haunt us through our treatment of others and through our performance of racial stereotypes that have been constructed through these narratives. Remember that stories reveal the powerful and powerless. Stories can empower and they can malign. Stories can humanize and they can also demonize. Stories can also be redemptive. Together, we construct narratives. We give stories life. We give stories power. It is therefore crucial that we consciously evaluate the stories told in social and cultural spheres so that we can identify the violence of that position, the violence in that narrative. In the words of Okri, we live by stories. We also live in them. The research participants live through the intergenerational stories that have been passed down to them, the stories in their family, the political stories that shape the majority's view of them, the stories told through the media, the stories told about educational underachievement and exclusion. The stories we tell, respond to, or perform illustrate the relationship we have with each individual in our community. Where do we stand in this intersubjective reality? How are we contributing to the construction, resuscitation, and longevity of deficient narratives? Here are some quotations from the research participant. Please take a minute to read what they have to say. These are their counter-narratives. How can we give life and power to their stories? Thank you very much for listening. If you would like to see my list of references, here they are. And then I will just quickly go back to that slide. Thank you very much.